All right, good evening, everybody. It's 5 p.m., our usual start time. Just a couple reminders, this meeting is being recorded and streamed live on YouTube. And then we also use the raised hand function when we are speaking and having discussions to keep everything on track. And with that, John, please get us started.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to see everyone's faces on here. It's good to be here. It's just beautiful weather, of course, and hopefully people are enjoying some time off this summer. And I want to say thank you, Valerie, for facilitating and running the meeting last time we had a meeting together. So thank you. It is right now it's about 5 o'clock. I want to call the meeting to order, and I would like to start with an introduction and also a centering exercise. So now that you're invited to, before we get started, I just want to say today we're convening to listen and learn from each other through reflection and discussion. And as we reevaluate and improve our public safety practices, we elevate the voices and experience of the community who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by inequitable systems. We thank you all who have advocated and worked on dismantling injustice in Tigard and a broader community. We build off of their efforts to create more equitable and just outcome for people of all backgrounds and abilities. So for the purpose of our meeting is to develop our understanding of current public safety structure and practices and procedures, to identify and eliminate institutional racism within Tigard Public Institution by centering equity and racial justice. We also bring forward the concerns and experiences of ourselves and of our community. We bring recommendation to the city leadership to improve the lived experience of all people in Tigard. Now that we have a broader understanding of why we're here, I'd like to go ahead and ask everyone to join me in the breathing exercise. So for this portion, you may turn off your cameras and I will take you through that exercise. Close your eyes and gaze softly downward. Feel the chair under your legs. Breathing deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Feel your hand on your lap. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Feel your feet on the ground. Breathe in deeply through your nose and out of your mouth. Slowly open your eyes and begin to breathe normally. Thank you all for participating and creating space with me. To get started, I'm going to ask Kim if you could begin roll call.
Of course. Commander McDonald.
Here.
Officer Nunn.
Here.
Shelby Rahala.
Here.
Michael O'Brien could not join us this evening, but we have Judge Oberdorfer with us again instead. Welcome back. Abdi Rahim Mohammed? No. Emilio Calderon?
Here.
Liz Newton? Okay. John Trin?
Present.
Jimmy Brown?
Here.
Lee Landers? Lee, I think I saw you on mute, but we can't hear you. Okay. Let us know if you have technical issues or if you want to message Tammy. She can definitely help. And let's see, where were we? Patty Lofgren?
I'm here.
Justin Lowe? Danny Rauda?
Here.
Valerie Sasaki?
Present.
Sean Stoldryer?
Here.
Nick Jarmer. No? And Jeff Mott.
Here.
All right. John, that is roll.
Thank you, Kim. Appreciate that. So now we come to the portion of our public comments. If I remember correctly, Eduardo said that there was no public comment that was submitted to us. So tonight, no community members have joined us or joined to speak. So public comments are vital to the board mission, and we welcome community feedback on our work. So if you have any comments for the board, written testimony must be submitted by 4:30 p.m. the day of the scheduled meeting. And if you'd like to speak at our meeting, please email our staff at eduardo@tigard-or.gov. That is EDUARDOR@tigard-or.gov. So we move on to the next portion of our agenda is for the chief to give us an update. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Chief Mike Alpine.
Thank you, John, and good evening, everybody. I just wanted to give you a quick update to let you know that Commander McDonald and I sat down. We went over all the recommendations for the body-worn camera that you guys provided. We do have another section today to see if there's any other additional stuff. This does require conversations with our city attorney, Shelby, who is here. She was on a 2-week military deployment, and so we've not had a chance to sit and really discuss some of the things that I need to discuss with her as it relates to public disclosure. And then I did present it a little bit to our Washington LEC. It's our law enforcement council. That's all your Washington County chiefs and sheriffs. Just asking for a little bit of input and feedback because the DA is also part of that group. And again, when you're talking about body-worn cameras, it's the DA's office. So I just want you guys all to know that we're working on it, and hopefully I have an update to you shortly. But with that, as we move forward.
Great. Does anyone have additional recommendations for the body-worn camera program? All right, I do not see any hands. So we will move on. Chief, unless you had anything else?
No, I don't. I'm having internet intermittence. So not to be rude, but I'll probably turn off my camera and listen until I need to speak. But other than that, no, that's it.
Okay, thank you, Chief. With that, we'll move on to the introduction to Tigard Police Officer Use of Force Training. Oh, yes, Valerie, please.
So I just wanted to ask, because I thought that we were going to be talking about legislative updates as well this session.
So the request from the last meeting was that we do the legislative updates with the chief at the same time as we have Representative Graber, because you guys wanted to hear both of them. So we are still talking with Justin about Representative Graber's schedule, tentatively scheduled for next time, and then we'll also do the chief's update then.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I couldn't remember where we left it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely on the radar coming up. Jimmy, please.
I'm sorry, I was a little slow on dealing with the issue around body-worn cameras, but I was reviewing some information a couple weeks ago regarding pistol grip cameras. Has the department looked at something similar to that along with the body-worn cameras?
I'm sorry, Jimmy, you cut out. What was it that you were looking at? What product or?
It was relating to pistol grip cameras. I think it's a product similar to a body worn camera, but it's actually attached to a pistol.
Okay. The way our, and the nice thing is we have Sergeant Erickson that can go far into the technical, but I believe the system is all, as soon as you draw your handgun, it activates. And then of course we have the lights. So Sergeant Erickson,
Thanks, Chief. Yeah, I'm not familiar with a pistol grip camera. The closest thing that I can think of to that is what's called a Taser Camera. And it worked on older generation tasers, and it attached to the bottom of the grip of the taser with the camera pointed forward so that the camera would have the same perspective as the front of the taser would. But they're very limited. It's a very small field of view. It's a very low quality video. And that's why we didn't really consider them any further than that. Plus, they're not available with the latest technology of taser that we were considering. So with the body worn cameras, when you draw your handgun from your holster or you activate your taser, it turns on the body camera for you and it starts recording at that point.
Thank you. Jimmy, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to find the reference piece that I was looking at, and then I'll just do it offline and send it off to Eduardo, and then we can send it over to the department, because we don't need to get into it just now at this point anyway. Just a thought. Thank you.
Thanks, Jimmy. All right, so moving on. Oh, Danny, please.
Yeah, about the body worn cameras, not necessarily a recommendation, just a thought or a question that I wasn't sure about, and I couldn't find any information explicitly in the policy document. I guess I was just wondering about sharing of data across agencies, and I was mainly thinking of it through the lens of like immigrant rights and justice, and I didn't see anything in the policy document about what the policy is around that, you know, if it could be potentially used, for example, to find an undocumented person, you know. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And Valerie, do you have something to add to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had some discussion of that issue, and my understanding was that the sanctuary laws applied in this context. You know, I'm sure Shelby will have additional comments on that, but you know, I think we've got statewide sanctuary laws at this point. So, but I think that's a really valid concern.
I'm seeing both Shelby and the commander nodding. Commander, please.
Yeah, Danny, I'd have to review the statute that specifically applies, but Oregon has some pretty clear language that talks about agencies in the state of Oregon not being able to assist federal agencies specifically for the purposes of finding somebody that's undocumented or that's here against federal law in this country against federal law. I'd have to review it about, you know, in terms of the sharing of like video, but I would venture to guess that it is included in that, if not specifically. I mean, at least in the way that it's worded, that we are not to assist them in the enforcement of immigration law. So it would, I feel confident saying it would fall under that. Yeah.
Valerie, please.
So I think also, and this maybe can be included in the chief's update, but I think it's House Bill 3265, and Representative Graber was a co-sponsor of that in the 2021 regular session. So, you know, maybe when Representative Graber comes and talks, she can add some more color to that, because I think that is relevant to what we're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any last questions, comments, recommendations on body-worn cameras this evening? All right. Commander, would you like to introduce the sergeants with us this evening?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Kim. So we have with us tonight two of our veteran sergeants. You all have met Sergeant Erickson before, but I don't know that we did a bio or anything like that to tell you a little bit about him. So Lee, go ahead and wave just so that they remember which of you is which. So Lee has been with us since March of 2004. He was promoted to sergeant in January of 2010. He has served as a patrol sergeant, a commercial crimes unit sergeant, and he's currently our traffic safety unit sergeant. But I'm going to read off the list of different things that he is responsible for instructing in the agency as well. So he's a firearms instructor, specifically pistol and less lethal. He is the lead instructor for our Force on Force, which is a scenario-based training that we do here in the department. He's our lead Taser instructor. He's a first aid CPR instructor certified, and he coordinates that program as well. He also is he's largely responsible for doing our use of force legal updates. So when there are legal changes by statute or by federal law, he helps to keep track of those things. And he's also an instructor at DPSST. Monty Fox, go ahead and wave there, Monty, if folks can see you. Monty has been with us since September of 2000. He's been a sergeant since March of 2007. He's a firearms instructor as well, both pistol and rifle. He is he's also a Force on Force instructor. So that's scenario-based training that we do, which is, and we'll talk more about that when we get into the training part of our conversations here later. And Monty is, you also are you currently an instructor at DPSST, Monty, or you've done that in the past?
I've done it in the past, but I'm not currently an instructor down there now.
Okay. And then Monty has also served as our criminal investigations unit sergeant, and he's currently our professional standards sergeant, which the chief, I think, has talked a little bit about that. That's a proof of concept position that we have. So he oversees and is directly involved in most of our internal investigations or complaints that come in from the outside, as well as internally. And he also is responsible for making sure that all of our training in the department is hitting the mark that we expect, but also in addition to that, being pulled off at the time frame that we want, in addition to every other little task that I give to Monty. Monty also has a unique perspective from his time as a sergeant in the criminal investigations unit. He was a backup sergeant for the major crimes team. So he was involved in some pretty high level investigations to include officer involved shootings. So he's seen that side from the investigative end, to include homicides and some other high profile cases that may take place in Washington County. So you don't want to hear any more from me. You want to hear from the subject matter experts on force response or use of force as it has shown up on the agenda. But both Monty and Lee have incredible experience in this area, and that's why you're hearing from them and not the chief or myself, because these are the two gentlemen that we turn to in the agency when we have those critical questions, and we want to make sure that we're pulling off the training for officers as the community expects. So Monty and Lee, take it away. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Commander. So I'm going to start you off tonight. We're going to break this down into several different sections. And so we'll pause for questions after we go through a section, but we want to get the information in front of you so you can have that baseline, and then whatever questions you may have after we go through that section, we'll go through. So the sections we're going to look at, we're going to start with Graham versus Conor, which is the landmark Supreme Court case that really governs use of force and the restrictions placed on us when we're using force, as well as how we analyze a use of force and its reasonableness. So after we go through that, then we're going to go into our policy, and Sergeant Fox will cover our policy as well as the ORSs that govern uses of force. And then we're going to kind of break it down, cover what does this all mean, talk about legitimacy, and then we're going to cap it off with some other considerations. So each one of those little bullet points right there is a different section where we'll pause afterwards to answer any questions that you may have before we move on to the next section. So I just ask that you kind of hold the questions until we break, and we'll let you know when we're at that point to answer any questions. just so that we don't miss anybody as we go, because it's kind of hard to see with the sharing screen set up here if somebody has a question or a hand up. So we'll start with Graham versus Conor. So this incident happened in November of 1984. And Mr. Graham suffered from diabetes at the time. This was, as diabetes was starting to become understood what it meant and what it was. So it wasn't really well known. But he was having a blood sugar episode, and he had asked a friend to drive him down to the corner convenience store to get some orange juice. So his friend drives him down there. As they pull into the parking lot, Graham jumps out of the car, runs inside to get orange juice. And as he enters the store, he sees that there's a really long line at the checkout, and he can't wait that long. So he quickly exits and hops back into his friend's car, telling him to take him to another friend's house to see if he had something that could help him. Across the street was Officer Conor doing something else when he observed Mr. Graham run into the store and quickly exit, and he became concerned that possibly a robbery had occurred at the store. So he made an investigatory stop of Mr. Graham and his friend about a half mile from the store. There, he asked them to wait in the car while he was getting some other officers to come and assist him in the investigatory stop. While they're waiting, Graham gets out of the car. He runs around it a couple times, and then he sits down on the curb, and then he passes out. In this ensuing confusion, several other officers arrived at the scene of the stop, and they handcuff Graham. They revive him. Graham's trying to reach into his pocket to show him he's got a diabetic identification card. His friends telling him he's diabetic, but the officers are thinking that Mr. Graham was intoxicated, and they weren't paying attention to any of those other indicators. They pick him up, or they pick up Mr. Graham, and they place him over the hood of the friend's car. And then they struggle to get him into the back of a patrol car while they're still trying to figure out what's going on. And Mr. Graham's putting up a significant amount of resistance. Shortly after they get him in the back of the patrol car, Officer Conor receives some information from the store that a robbery didn't occur, that there was no crime there. So they drive Mr. Graham home and release him. And in all of that, he suffered a broken foot, some cuts to his wrist, a bruised forehead, and an injured shoulder. And he also had ringing in his ears that persisted up until this was heard at trial a couple years later. So this worked its way through the federal court system and eventually made its way to the United States Supreme Court for review. And in February of 1989, so a little less than 5 years after the event occurred, was when the Supreme Court heard the information. And the questions that they needed to answer in reviewing this case was whether or not Mr. Graham needed to show that the police acted maliciously and statistically for the very purpose of causing harm to establish police used excessive force. So before this case was ruled upon, that was the standard that had kind of prevailed across the land. It started in one of the federal circuit courts, but either the officers acted with good intent or they acted maliciously and sadistically for the very purpose of causing harm. And if it was malicious and sadistic, then it was excessive force versus reasonable force. And then the other question that the Supreme Court wanted to answer was whether or not an excessive force claim must be examined under the Fourth Amendment's objective reasonableness standard instead of any of these other standards like malicious and sadistic for the very purpose of causing harm. So in May of 1989, 3 months later, they decided that no, the standard of malicious and sadistic was not the right standard for reviewing this, and that yes, the Fourth Amendment's objective reasonableness standard is the proper analysis for claims of excessive force by government officials. So the Fourth Amendment, for those who are unaware, is the amendment that grants everybody the security of their person, their houses, their papers, and effects from unreasonable search and seizure by the government. And when we use force on somebody, if we stop somebody, if we have to handcuff somebody, we are using force on them. We are affecting a seizure of their person, and it has to be analyzed under that objective reasonableness standard of the Fourth Amendment. So, like I said, rather than it being some sort of other standard under due process or cruel and unusual punishment, it was decided that it had to be under the Fourth Amendment's objective reasonableness standard to determine whether or not a use of force by a police officer was excessive or whether it was reasonable. And with that, we'll pause for questions.
I don't see any hands.
Okay. Then I will turn it over to Sergeant Fox. Oh, do I have two more? No, those are ones I covered. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I do have a couple more slides. I got ahead of myself. So the Supreme Court went on to explain a little bit more that all claims that law enforcement officials have used excessive force, deadly or not, in the course of an arrest, investigatory stop, or other seizure of a free citizen are properly analyzed under the Fourth Amendment's objective reasonableness standard. And that reasonableness inquiry is whether the officer's actions are objectively reasonable in light of the facts and circumstances confronting them without regard to their intent or motivation. So in other words, it wasn't a view of what the reason why the officer had to use force, what their motivation was behind it. They could be completely upset that somebody caused somebody else harm, and that's and while they're fighting with them, they're upset about that fact. As long as the amount of force was reasonable under the totality of the circumstances, and that reasonableness was objectively based. In other words, it was based on facts and not just opinions. The reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, and its calculus must embody an allowance for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second decisions about the amount of force necessary in a particular circumstance. So the standard here is the reasonable officer, and so that's viewed as somebody who's well-trained and experienced, and if they're placed in the same situation as the officer who's under review, if they would make the same decision, then that's a reasonable use of force. And there has to be some sort of allowance for the fact that these are very fast. We don't have a lot of time to consider all of the information. We have to make split-second decisions under tense, dynamic, and rapidly evolving circumstances. And so there has to be some sort of an allowance for the fact that somebody's life might be at jeopardy, our life may be at jeopardy. And so we're making these decisions under stress, and we're trying to do the best we can with the information available to us. But again, that stress and those other split-second factors are weighing in on the decisions that we make in a circumstance. And I'll pause again for any questions. Thank you, Monty, for catching that. Yeah.
Jeff, I see your hand.
Yeah, thank you. How does the calculus for the split-second decisions combine with the calculus that a police officer is very highly trained on situations that they're going through?
I'll talk about that in this one right here. We'll talk about that.
Okay, yeah, so Sergeant Fox is going to cover that in just a little bit when he gets to one of his points. Thank you for the question.
Cool, thanks.
Any other questions before we get going on this? Okay.
No other hands.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about some of the Tigard PD policies. While the Fourth Amendment and the Graham factors give us a big scope, we're kind of narrowing the view here for the city of Tigard. These are Tigard general policies. So our use of force policy, officers shall use only that amount of force that reasonably appears necessary given the facts and circumstances perceived by the officer at the time of the event to accomplish a legitimate law enforcement purpose. The reasonableness of force will be judged from the perspective of here's answering that question there, of a reasonable officer on scene at the time of the incident. Any evaluation of reasonableness must allow for the fact that officers are often forced to make those split-second decisions about the amount of force that reasonably appears necessary in a particular situation with a limited amount of information and circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving. So what it's saying there is the information we've received from our senses on scene, the information we received from dispatch on the way there, all of those factors is all we have to operate on at the scene. So we can't operate on hindsight that we find out 2 or 3 days after the event. All we can use to judge the officers on is what they have, the information they have at the scene there. The next policy, going into deadly force applications. Any officer may use deadly force to protect him or herself or others from what he or she reasonably believes would be an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury. So again, we're back to that reasonableness standard that we believe we're saving someone's life by doing something that involves deadly use of force. In addition, An officer may use deadly force to stop a fleeing subject when the officer has probable cause to believe that the person has committed or intends to commit a felony involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious bodily injury or death, and the officer reasonably believes that there is an imminent risk of serious bodily injury or death to any other person if the subject is not immediately apprehended. Under such circumstances, a verbal warning should precede the use of deadly force where feasible. This is a hard one for people to grab, but I can go back to my time as part of the major crime scene. We had a bank robbery in Beaverton where they stabbed some patrons of the bank. That person, as he left, stabbed someone in the parking lot, came to Tigard, stabbed some people in Tigard. And when we caught up to him, the person ran on foot. Had the person started to run into a crowded area, deadly force would have been authorized. He had shown that he was willing to use violence. He had no problem killing people at the bank. And so by doing that, it escalated our ability to use force to stop him because the public was at a greater harm because of that. Imminent, when we're judging deadly force, imminent does not mean immediate or instantaneous. An imminent danger may exist even if the subject, and not at that very moment, is pointing a weapon at someone. For example, imminent danger may exist if an officer reasonably believes any of the following. The person has a weapon or is attempting to access one, and it is reasonable to believe the person intends to use it against the officer or another. Or if the person is capable of causing serious bodily injury or death without a weapon, and it's reasonable to believe the person intends to do so. So this right here, say the person had run into a crowd and we couldn't see that, or was running towards a crowded school, and we couldn't see the knife in his hand. Even though he's not instantly stabbing someone, we could have used deadly force to stop him before he started using deadly force, before he started stabbing people at the school. Now we're going to talk about how the ORS, the Oregon Revised Statute, kind of dictates use of force. So this is kind of somewhere in between the Tigard policy, which is pretty narrow, and the national standard, which is a little more broad. The use of physical force in making an arrest or preventing an escape. A peace officer is justified in using physical force upon another person only when and to the extent that the peace officer reasonably believes it necessary to make an arrest or to prevent the escape from custody of an arrested person unless the peace officer knows that the arrest is unlawful. We'll get into the unlawfulness part later. And then for self-defense or to defend the third person from what the peace officer reasonably believes to be the use or imminent use of physical force while making or attempting to make an arrest or while preventing or attempting to prevent an escape. So again, it's a lot of information here, but boiled down, we can only use deadly physical force when someone's life is in danger based on the factors we have at the time. The reasonableness factors that a reasonable officer put in that situation with that information would do at the time. So with that, finishing this part, I anticipate questions on this one. Any questions?
Yes, Valerie.
So one of the questions that comes up when we're talking about this area, of course, is scalability, right? So you have a defendant or a suspect who has a knife and the police officer pulls a gun. You know, how do you evaluate that situation, or how do you explain that situation? Because it's use of force, right? But if they pull a gun and shoot the person with a knife, then of course the survivors and family and friends, say, well, it's disproportionate response.
Well, the law allows us to respond to a level that prevents us from getting hurt. Mm-hmm. If he's using deadly force or has the ability to use deadly force against us, our means of using deadly force don't matter. Okay. If we see someone about to stab someone in the road and we hit him with our car, that's a use of deadly force. The manner in which we deliver deadly force doesn't matter. It matters that we have the authority to use deadly force.
In that kind of circumstance too, it kind of goes to what does the officer perceive as the intent behind drawing the knife? If he's just drawing the knife and he's not threatening anybody with it, then we don't really necessarily have a crime or another reason to use force on them other than just to talk with them. But if they advance on us, if they advance on somebody else with that knife, then we're perceiving that to be a very significant or deadly threat. And we have to take action to thwart that kind of threat, including using deadly force to stop it.
Sure. And I do have a follow-up question. So the example that you used where you have someone who has a knife who's running towards a crowded district or a crowded area, what analyses or what training do you put in place to help officers evaluate, the potential risk to an officer shooting at a fleeing suspect, versus risk of hitting some sort of bystander in that situation?
Absolutely, and that's a great question. I'm going to defer a little bit on that one until later on. When we talk about our specific disciplines of training, we'll talk about the training standards we try to train to. But we have 4 cardinal rules at the range every time that we reiterate with the officers every time at the range. We treat all guns as if they're loaded. Okay, so we always think any gun that we have is loaded. We never point the gun at anything we're not willing to destroy, which could be, sweeping the gun over an innocent person to point it at a bad guy. We never shoot at anything we're not willing to shoot. And then we always know our target and what lies beyond. What that means is when we're shooting at a target, whether it be a target at the range or someone trying to do us harm on the road, we always have to pay attention to what's behind them. So at the range, we know we've got a dirt backstop. In the real world, we try and have a clear backstop as well.
Sure. Thank you.
We'll get into more details on that as we get into our individual training disciplines.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Liz.
Yeah, I suspect the question I have will be covered during the training. I was sort of following up along the lines of what Valerie said, is training officers to acknowledge quickly, because I know they're in a really, tense, fast-moving situation, how to maybe I don't want to use the word escalate, but how to move through what their options are. And I am assuming that's probably a training issue. So you'll probably cover it. And if you don't, when we get there, I'll ask another question. But I think it sounds like that's what you're going to do, is cover it then. Thanks.
We will. We'll touch on it in force on force.
Thanks, Liz. And Nick.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate you guys going over this subject. It's certainly a difficult subject to discuss, especially over the last year and a half. My question, or I guess maybe more of a comment, in the ORS, it says prevent escape from custody. Does our police department consider somebody being detained as in custodies, like sit here on the curb for a second while I run your license or looking for ID or something? I guess if that makes sense, that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out what custody actually means and when that is in effect.
Sure. And yes, if we detain somebody, we've told them they're not free to go. And we have a legal basis for doing that. That's defined in statute and policy. It's called, we have to have a reasonable suspicion that they're involved in criminal activity before we can forcibly detain somebody. And the law allows for us to use a reasonable amount of force to effect a detention if we need to. And if the person tries to leave, then we can give them the lawful order to say, you're not free to go, you can't leave. And if they continue to follow that or to violate that, then we tell them you're under arrest, and now they're under arrest for a crime.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And Jeff.
Thanks. We go back one slide, Lee. And could you just provide an example of the last bullet here, where it's basically someone that's unarmed?
A good example of that would be what happened in New York a couple summers ago with somebody using a vehicle as a weapon, where they were driving into a crowd or driving towards a crowd in a crowded walkway, and we're trying to run people over. It's not what you would consider a weapon. It's a vehicle, but in the manner which he's using, it can cause serious bodily injury or death. And so that's an example of that.
Okay, thank you.
Or you could picture something, even we're using their person, picture a domestic violence victim where she's unconscious and he's banging her head against the ground. Something to that effect. These are things that could cause imminent physical injury or death.
Thank you. Any other questions before we move forward?
Okay.
No hands.
All right, so to try and help us break this down a little bit better, to understand what all this means, you can kind of think of this as a bowling alley, and we've put the bumpers out on the bowling alley. We want to operate within these guidelines that are created by Graham versus Conor, by ORS, and by department policy. And so that's the guidelines we're in. And when we're analyzing decisions made by the officers, and when we're training officers to consider the information in front of them, and when making their decision, we provide them with what are called the Graham factors. So we're going to go what the Supreme Court said in Graham versus Conor and break it down a little bit further and talk about different aspects of that case and what they provided as guidance for us in making decisions. So one of the first things that they looked at is what is the severity of the crime? And they said that there's it's this balancing act, and the more severe the crime, the more force that would be reasonable to effect an arrest or a seizure of a person if it's necessary under the circumstance. So first question is, do we have legal standing? Do we have a crime that we're investigating? Do we have some other reason why we're there and that we need to effect a custody of a person? Is the crime inherently violent? Is it a felony or is it a misdemeanor? So different levels of crimes of violence like assaults or sexual assaults or homicides versus property crimes like theft and fraud. The next question is does the suspect pose an immediate threat to the safety of officers or others present? And to analyze that, we talk about intent, ability, and opportunity. So the intent is what's perceived, and that can be perceived by what the person's saying, by what they're doing, or how they're acting. We're trying to get to what it is they're trying to do, what their intent is. Ability or means. So if somebody says they're going to stab a person, do they actually have a weapon with which they can stab somebody, or do they have access to a weapon they can use to stab somebody? And then opportunity is if they're threatening to stab a significant other, is that significant other person present, or are they miles away? What's the opportunity? And if all three of those are present, then we have the immediacy of the threat that we have to deal with. And we go back to what's the severity of the issue at hand, or what's the severity of the threat to the safety of us or others to determine what's reasonable for us to act and do in response to those threats. And then we look at, is the suspect actively resisting arrest? And that's a yes or no question. So once we've established probable cause to make an arrest, and we've told a person they're in arrest, and we try to take them into custody, do they resist? Do they put up some sort of resistance? And it's a sliding scale. It's a yes or no question. But then if it's yes, how much resistance are they presenting to our attempts to place them into custody? And the more significant their resistance, the more significant amount of force that we can use to overcome that resistance and get them into custody. The next one is if they're trying to attempt to evade by flight. And again, it's a yes or no question. And if it's yes, then we have to look at, okay, what's the severity of the crime and what's the immediacy of the threat? If this is a person who just passed or just attempted to steal, say, a candy bar from a store, and they didn't threaten anybody else and they're just running away, we're not going to use a lot of force to stop them. We're probably going to try to get them to stop by telling them to stop. And telling them they're under arrest, but we're not going to use a lot of force to stop them versus somebody who might have just significantly assaulted somebody else. We're going to be using a lot of force to try and stop them. Or if somebody else if they're threatening to harm somebody else, we're going to use force to try and stop them from getting away. And then the last thing that we look at for the Graham factors is, are the circumstances tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving? And this is kind of a paintbrush that we look at in terms of changing how much force is necessary. So if we're talking about, we may have to fight with somebody to get them into custody in the front yard of a house that's nice and grass and flat, versus if we have to use force to get somebody into custody on the side of Highway 217 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with traffic zooming by at 55 to 60 miles an hour. When the risk in the environment is greater, we can use more force to overcome that resistance faster and get them into custody, so it's safer for us and safer for them to get them out of that kind of environment while we're trying to take them into custody. So with that, we'll pause for questions.
Valerie, please.
So one of the things that doesn't seem to be in this, and maybe you'll be talking about it later, is if it's, for example, a situation where you know that there's a mental health issue. Because I think a lot of the really challenging situations we've seen sort of regionally and nationally in the last year have involved, use of force situations where there's been someone's having a mental health crisis, and we talked about that before. And so I don't know how that fits within this, but if you could address that, that would be really helpful, I think, for our analysis.
Absolutely. And that is a great question and something we're always asking ourselves. And where that fits in really goes back to the immediacy of the threat. So to go back to that slide, when we're not dealing with a criminal issue at all, if it's just somebody who's in crisis and maybe threatening to harm themselves, then we have to look at the immediacy of the threat. And by and large, and we've been doing it for 10 to 12 years now, if there's nobody else in harm's way, we do our best to try and tie this person into resources through MHRT or crisis line or things like that. But at the end of the day, if they're not threatening to harm anybody else, they're only threatening to harm themselves, we walk away from those kinds of situations. We may leave eyes on to make sure they don't go into the neighborhood and start causing problems for neighbors or threatening anybody else. But we're not gonna precipitate a situation where we're gonna have to use force if nobody else is in harm's way.
Thank you.
Any other questions? John, please.
I don't know how to phrase the question, but I'm just curious in terms of when you have a situation when you know that there is a protest. At what point do you feel that in terms of you prepared your officers to use force or not in that type of situation?
So protests are a different animal. Those are usually pre-planned responses by the police department. So we'll have an incident command set up and we'll have resources there to deal with the situation. And then incident command is going to make the decision when this is no longer people addressing grievances, but it's now turned into criminal activity. And that's the primary focus. And then that's once incident command has made that decision, we've already set out rules of engagement and limitations on actions. And that's understood by everybody involved. And so if we're now dealing with crimes and we've decided that this is a riot and no longer just a protest, then we would take the actions to protect property and protect lives based upon those rules of engagement.
And I don't see any other hands.
Okay. So to zoom back forward, oh, yeah, one more.
Liz, please.
I'm sorry. I do want to follow up on Valerie's question. So when I did my ride along, which was great, I want to do it again. We went to a domestic violence situation and it was, no, I didn't go in, but it wasn't a great situation. And I think the officers determined that there was a mental health, issue there, but it wasn't, that was a domestic. And so the other person was, in some danger. And so I guess to follow up on what Valerie's saying, sometimes you do have a situation where you might have to assess how compliant you can get the person who's perpetrating some, bad behavior or violence or whatever. And how do you sort that out? Does that go to your de-escalation training or how does that work? I didn't ask at the time, but it occurs to me after Valerie's question that there may be situations where you've got some, maybe not life-threatening threat to another person, but there is some immediate threat to another person. And how does that work? Is that a different kind of training or how does that work? Thanks.
So, that wraps up into all of this. And one of the things that we have to look at here is there's no bright line rules for any of this. This is all, it's a big gray area because of what the standards are of that objectable reasonableness. It's a broad scale. And like I said at the beginning of this, it's a bowling alley with bumpers out and we're trying to operate within those bumpers created by the law and in our policy. And when we're dealing with potential mental illness and crimes, we still have to take action on the crimes, especially at domestic violence scenes. We're mandated by federal and state law to take custody of a person who's assaulted or has menaced, which means they've threatened another person with imminent harm, into custody and take them to jail. We can't walk away from those situations. Whether or not the mental health component contributed to that is a legal question that has to be answered at court and not by us. But if we have probable cause to believe somebody has committed a crime of domestic violence, we have to take them into custody and take them to jail. So we're kind of balancing and looking at all those actions and try to figure out what's the most reasonable action for us to take here.
Okay. So as a follow-up, what you're doing is analyzing that situation and trying to figure out what you need to do to get that person into custody. And
Correct.
not go any farther than you have to, but it might be complicated if they're in a mental health crisis.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're going to do our best to try and talk with them and get them to go along with the program and work through all those steps, which we have years and years of experience doing. But at the end of the day, we still have to take somebody into custody and take them to jail if we have that probable cause to arrest them.
Okay. Thank you.
So in the biggest, broadest strokes of this stuff, force responses are this balancing act of the need for a government intrusion, which going back is that seizure of a person, against the reasonably foreseeable risks that are created by the techniques or tools we're using to achieve a lawful objective, an arrest, a detention, or a threat reduction to the situation. So we're constantly balancing what is our need here to arrest this person or take this person into custody versus what are the risks that are created by that. And when the need or the risks outweigh the need, then we're not going to use that tool or tactic or technique. We're going to figure out a different way to achieve that because it's not reasonable anymore. And it's a sliding scale. It's a constant evaluation that we're doing in these situations from moment to moment until we've taken somebody into custody or reduced the threat that was created by the circumstances. And before I move on, I'll take a minute to answer any questions that folks may have for that particular point. Okay. So, and when I talked earlier about trying to envision this as a bowling alley with the bumpers out, the guidelines that we're operating in, there's three different levels. And so the U.S. Constitution, the Fourth Amendment would be like the bowling alley, the bowling lane without the bumpers out. You got the gutters there and everything. It's the widest possible path for us to move forward. And it's justification based upon the U.S. Constitution and the Fourth Amendment and what the Supreme Court said in Graham versus Conor. Moving in a little bit tighter than that is the Oregon Constitution, and the section of the Oregon Constitution that's synonymous with the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is Article 1, Section 9. It's also what Oregon revised statutes say, and it's also, if our policy is written correctly, it's what our policy says, and it matches what the Oregon Constitution and ORS says. So those are a little bit more restrictive than what the federal government says. And then the smallest lane for us to operate in is that public perception or expectation. This is what the public perceives when they look at a video of something that happened and they make a judgment on the information available to them on whether or not what the officer did was reasonable. We're striving for that, but we have to reach that second level, that Oregon Constitution, that department policy level when we're taking our actions for it to be legal. The other part of it is working on establishing police legitimacy by meeting public expectation and public perception. And when we have opportunities like this to help explain these differences and the calculus that we're using and the decision making and all the training that we do, we're helping to bring public perception closer to what the law is. At the same time, we're working on giving our officers the necessary training and experience to be able to make those decisions of not just what's legal, but what's the right thing to do. And an example of that is going back to that deal with persons in crisis when there's no criminal activity afoot, nobody else is at risk. Us walking away is the right thing to do. We could stay there and continue to work through the problem, or we can make it worse by going in And that may be the legal thing or legally justified for us to do, but it's not the right thing for us to do. The right thing for us to do is to walk away trying to help this person get to the resources that they need, or give them the space they need to calm down to a different level, to where they're able to understand the qualities of their actions and things like that. So any questions on that one?
Valerie, please.
Sorry, me again. So where do you think the biggest gaps are between public expectation, perception, and what the law requires?
I think a lot of that is just what is seen on media, whether it's movies, television, or in social media, versus what is people are capable of actually doing. When you see superheroes or not even superheroes, but cop movies with them doing great things, or as an example, like CSI, they have all these amazing tools and techniques that they can use in any crime that they want. But the reality is, for low-level thefts and things like that, we're not going to bring in a crime lab to solve that. We're going to save that for when we need it for a homicide or a sexual assault case. So I think that creates this gap between what's possible for us to do, what's reasonable for us to do, and what the public thinks we can do, and what they think we do every day.
Right. And so, I mean, I think more, because that's more in just general procedure, right? Because we're talking about use of force. So where there's, are there things that you think that the public should know specifically with respect to use of force that they maybe are not grasping, that maybe they have learned by watching all of these police procedurals that we have all over the television?
Sure. One thing they should know is we don't fight with people every day.
Okay.
We hardly, I think it's less than or it's right around 0.1% of our public contacts and in any kind of use of force.
Any force.
And that's, from having to guide somebody into a cuffing position on up. And so it's very rare, but when you see it in social media, when you see it in the news, you just keep getting hit with this scene over and over again. And it makes it look like every call we go on, we're fighting with somebody, and that's just not the truth.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
And that's why forums like this are so valuable. We can get this information out to 20 people here tonight, who can get the information out to another 20 people each that understand our policies, our procedures, and our limitations. So this kind of educational forum is great for this.
Not to mention all the people on YouTube who might be watching right now. Commander, you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add that. So in 2020, for example, we used force as an agency 47 times total, which figures out to 0.13% of the calls that we go on was a use of force. And like Lee mentioned, the important thing to recognize with that is the vast majority of those are pretty insignificant, but nonetheless, what's considered a use of force. So maybe an escort, for lack of a better word, a takedown, where someone was resisting and the officer basically guides the person to the ground. That's a use of force. We're making them do something that's outside of what they're wanting to do, basically. So if you end up on the ground at the hands of a police officer, it's going to be a use of force. So the point of us not using force very often is very true, because it just doesn't happen all that much. And fortunately, that's the case, that it doesn't happen all that often.
And I don't see any other hands.
Okay. Then we'll go ahead and move on here. So other things to think about here. Whenever we're able to, we have to give a warning and give the subject an opportunity to comply. This goes through all uses of force. If we tell someone to put their hands behind their back, we have to give them the opportunity to do that before we start forcing them, before we use force to move their body into those positions. So we want to give people the opportunity to comply before we use force at any time. If we're going to use our taser, we want to give them a warning before we do it. Give them an opportunity to comply so we don't have to use force. Here at Tigard, we have a policy that includes a duty to intercede. So if you observe someone using force that is clearly beyond that, which is objectively reasonable, you need to intercede when you are in a position to do so. We are all human and subject to influences like emotion. What this means is if you're on scene and you see someone using force, say someone's emotions are too high, and you think the amount of force they're using is too high, it's greater than needed to control the situation, you have a duty as a Tigard police officer to intercede, to step in and stop that from happening. So it's written in our policy that we require all police officers here to do that. You are also required to report to a supervisor as soon as feasible if you witness another member of the department using force that is potentially beyond that which is objectively reasonable. So if I see someone using force, not only do I have to intervene right then and there, but I have to tell a supervisor about it so an investigation can start and make sure that what was done was reasonable. There are few situations that require us to respond expediently and before we have sufficient resources immediately available to us. So when we're talking about our exigency and de-escalating, we want to wait if we can. Here in Tigard, we've got pretty good resources. We've got people on the road all times. We have a supervisor on the road at all times, but we also have mutual aid agreements. So we can bring in police officers from other agencies. We're developing the mental health resource team along with other resources like that we can bring in. So if we have the ability to, we want to meet up and plan our response with other officers so we can make sure we have the resources and tools that we need there. And we don't want to place ourselves in a situation that precipitates us using an unnecessary level of force. So a lot of situations, we can de-escalate the situation simply by having multiple officers on scene. If you get a guy at a bar fight, and he wants to fight the cops that show up. Well, if you show up with 4 or 5 cops, a lot of times they don't want to fight anymore. That de-escalated the situation. That lowered the level of force we had to use to control the situation. When we talk about de-escalation, it's a goal or a result. It's not a set of tactics. It's not a set of techniques. There's no magic word that de-escalates someone. De-escalation is a process where we try and use as little force as we have to control the situations. We achieve de-escalation, but by taking the time to slow situations down and using the processes we use every day, almost every encounter to our benefit. Like the commander talked about, 0.1% of our contacts with citizens involve uses of force. 99% of this job is talking to people. The people that excel at this job are ones that can communicate with people. They're ones that can connect with people. So having the ability to de-escalate just by talking is usually what we do. But if we can, we use time, distance, environment, containment to our advantage to control the situations. And then we can work towards an engagement with the subject that slows things down. We want to create as much of a barrier as we can so we can have safe contacts with citizens. So,
We got a question.
yeah, so before we go on, I know there's some questions for this. So questions on the exigency and de-escalation?
Jimmy, are you still with us?
Yes. So this is relating to the duty to intercede.
Yes, sir.
What data does the department have on situations where a Tigard police officer has had to utilize the policy relating to duty to intercede, or do we have any data on that? And if you do and we don't have it right now, that's okay, as long as we have an opportunity to come back to it. And secondly, I think the information that you have here tonight is really excellent. You're really clarifying some things that the general public does not have an opportunity to hear or to reflect upon. A suggestion that I have is, and granted, the PSAB is representative of community members, professionals, folks with interest in what's happening around public safety, but there's a finite number of us. And yes, we do have our own networks in which we connect through and to. But at the same time, I'm thinking, perhaps the department may want to look at doing a Police 101 quarterly session, especially as we're moving through the pandemic and we're now able to presumably get people back in face-to-face situations, and establish a way in which you can have a community meeting that explores these same topics. Because I think that, obviously the more people that get a chance to hear this, the more they're able to understand, one, the gravity of police work, two, understanding how police operate in certain kinds of situations and how you operate within the policy guidelines that the department has. So, again, that may not be something that you necessarily want to say, oh God, that sounds great today, but certainly it might be something that you want to think about going forward, because the more information that can get out there to the community beyond just what the PSAB can do and beyond what the numbers of folks who might be looking on YouTube may do, I think it's just a good a process for community engagement.
Well, to address your second, the community meetings, we used to do a citizens a citizens academy here at Tigard, where we would invite the public into a 6 or 8 week long academy. They would come once a week, once every other week, and meet with in this kind of environment where they would learn about the department, learn that. So we have had things like that in the past that have gone on. I don't know about plans for the future. As for the second part about data on duty to intercede, I'm not aware of any. Are you?
I'm not aware of any either. And I just want to touch on the public outreach aspect of this. One of the things we had done for a couple of years before the pandemic hit was have a police department open house, where one day we opened up the police department for tours and static displays and things like that. And one of the things that we showed, we have a trainer that we use, a video simulation training system that plays a video with actors that prompt a officer to make a decision about what level of force is reasonable. We use that to show the community some of the training and prompt conversations like this in a smaller setting, in a tent. And if it's certainly something that we can look at doing more in the future. I think it's a great point from you, Jimmy, that this is a great opportunity for us to help explain these concepts to other people.
Thank you. And Commander, would you like to add on?
Yeah, Jimmy, I was going to add that I can't remember a time when we've had an instance where an officer had to intercede at the point where another officer was using excessive force. I think all of us have been in situations where, emotions were high and somebody stepped in and said, hey, why don't you take a break for a second and step away before it even got to that point. And I can give a personal story of how I feel like our culture and our agency here at Tigard PD has such a different feel to it. Is last year, shortly after the incident with George Floyd, one of our officers asked me, he's about a 5-year officer here. He asked how that could even happen and why the other officers didn't step in to take action. And I really feel like that's the culture of our agency, that something like that wouldn't happen because our officers are thinking about that. Like, why didn't somebody step in was the question. He was so confused and had such a hard time understanding that, why somebody didn't step in and take action, one of the other officers on scene. Now, I don't know the answers why, and we won't get into that, but it made me feel like the culture in our organization is such that our officers would step in and they would intervene before it would get to a point where something horrible happens, where even something like, God forbid something horrible like someone get hurt or killed, but where an officer does something so egregious that they end up getting in trouble or losing their career out of making a poor decision. So we talk about this type of thing in training on a regular basis, and the culture of our agency is such that we're going to make sure that we're doing the best thing we can for our fellow officers to make sure they don't step into that. the point about the video simulation training, that's something that the members of the PSAB are going to get an opportunity to experience should they choose to. But we also need to give you a base of education before you go and go into that, because we feel very strongly about the fact that the members of the board have the understanding of where of what regulates how we respond to someone and that necessitates us to use force. So you're getting some of that training that will provide that base level that should you want to schedule a time to come in and be able to go through that video simulation training, you're going to get that opportunity. And so we'll be doing that sometime in the reasonably near future to allow people that chance to come in and see some of the training that we put our officers through. But we felt like we needed to talk about how we do things and what regulates our ability to use force in response to, you know, the actions that someone has done. And really that's what it is. The people that we're working with, the people that force is used upon, we're reacting to their actions, right? It's their actions that dictate what we do. So if we can de-escalate a situation, that's obviously the most preferred way to do it. So sorry, Monty and Leah, I won't keep talking.
No problem.
Any other questions before we move on? All right.
Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about our training here. So we'll talk about the specific skill training, but outside of that, force response training is largely a decision-making skill that is developed and evaluated continually through our training. Each training discipline associated with force response use the best practices to assist officers with decision-making skills while working on the physical skills being exercised. Examples from each of the disciplines will be elaborated on in the next slides. So firearms. So I've been a firearms instructor here since early 2000s, 2002, 2003. I've been a firearms instructor outside of here for 10 years before that. But when it comes to firearms training here, we've got federal standards we have to apply to all of our training. So our federal standards, training must include each of the following: target identification. Now this is making sure we're shooting the right target. So we're going to have targets that come up that we have one to shoot, one not to shoot, things like that. So we have to be able to pick out which one is the bad guy. Moving targets. Now that can be a target on a moving system or the officers moving. In the real world, everybody isn't static. So that makes it a little more realistic for our training. Discretionary targets, which are shoot, don't shoot targets. So that could be a target that turns around real quick. You've seen the ones with the guy with a gun in his hand, or they turn around, they've got a coffee mug in their hand. It can be a target that turns like that. So it's a shoot, don't shoot. And then the final federal standard is low light shooting. 2/3 of our officers work part of their shift in low light. So chances are, there's a good chance that any kind of shootings will involve a low light situation. So we are required to incorporate that in our training every year. Beyond that, we go to the state standards. And for the state standards, you have to pass all the academy training while you're there to become a certified officer. And then you have to pass 8 hours of firearms or use of force training per year. Then we get to the Tigard PD standards. So these are even a little tougher. So you have to pass all department training. You have to qualify on the rifle once per year. And you have to qualify at least twice per year on a handgun. So on rifles, the reason it's only once per year is we don't have a facility here in Tigard to use it, to shoot the rifles. We need at least 100 yards to shoot the rifles. So we need to travel out of time. So all of our training, when we do rifle training, involves an hour of travel time each direction. So we're losing that much training, or we're paying that much overtime to get that training in, because Tigard's a city. They're not making more land here in Tigard. So we have to travel to do that. So that limits our ability, but we still have to qualify once a year. With handgun, we've got to do it twice a year. We utilize a lot of different ranges there. Again, there's none in Tigard, but we can utilize ones in Sherwood. We've utilized one out in Dundee, and then one in McMinnville as well. So for the firearms, we have to, our standards are a little more strict than the state standards, which are a little more strict than the federal standards. And we're always, there are continuing training. And then go to the next one.
Right, and Sergeant, I'm going to break in for 1 minute. We're at a decision point. We have 5 minutes left in the time that we had allotted for the training topic for this meeting. So the option that I want to put out for the group is we can either continue with this training, and it may not finish in this meeting, and we'll continue that as well, or we can move into the public outreach component in 5 minutes. And Valerie, I see your hand.
I hate to break up this presentation. I mean, I would rather continue with this than switch gears midstream.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of information that we're covering. This might still be broken up across meetings, but absolutely get the sentiment. I see one thumbs up. Is everyone agree that we'll push off the public outreach until another meeting? Great, lots of thumbs up. Thank you. Sergeants, please continue.
Okay, the next component is our defensive tactics training. Defensive tactics are those skills that are primarily focused on hands, arms, legs, and feet to physically control someone who is resisting arrest or trying to harm someone. So defensive tactics are everything from an escort hold, which is we grab someone's arm and you walk them out of a building, to handcuffing someone. So our defensive tactics, we train proper, safe ways to handcuff someone. And I don't know if if it's still a fact, but it used to be the highest number of use of force complaints involved handcuffing people, because honestly, that's what we do the most. So scenarios are used to evaluate and develop skills like handcuffing, using leverage to place subjects into positions to be safely guided or restrained, and other actions to defend ourselves or others before having to resort to other weapons or tools. It's like we talked about with the de-escalation, where if we can put someone in a position of disadvantage where they don't want to fight, we can get the handcuffs on and safely detain them so there is no use of force, which means they don't get hurt, no officers get hurt, there's no use of force, and it protects everybody. So by putting them in that position of disadvantage, whether that be the number of officers there or the position they're in, it makes it safer for everybody. So that's a good, if you want to go into these, you want to break for questions?
Let's go ahead and go to the questions.
We've got a question from Lee.
Hello, I was just wondering, is it mandatory for you guys to double lock the cuffs every single time you put handcuffs on somebody and you have to put them in your patrol car?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Lee. And Commander?
Yeah, I just wanted to let everyone know that the vast majority of our uses of force actually fall in this category under defensive tactics. So this is an area that really does need quite a large amount of training, because when we're talking about when we use force, it's almost always going to be in those resistive areas where someone's maybe trying to pull away, they're trying to resist arrest, and I mean, I'd have to look up the specifics of exactly how many fall in there out of the number of times that we used force last year, but the vast majority are going to fall in this category in defensive tactics, where you're hands-on with someone and you're using your hands to use force.
Thank you. Valerie?
So this is more out of my curiosity, but I was just wondering, you have police officers of all different sizes and shapes, right? And so what works for one police officer is not going to work for someone like myself who's 5'2.5". And so do you modify the training as between the different officers who are involved, or do you use techniques that are more universal?
A little bit of both. We use techniques that involve controlling joints, which make it a little easier for a person with a smaller statute to do. But a person with a smaller statute, they tend to be better at communicating. So a lot of times there's less force, they can talk their way out of situations, or as we say, talk someone into handcuffs, get them to voluntarily comply. Or they know to bring backup to situations where they can have other officers. That way we have the overwhelming number of officers, which can again prevent us from having to use force.
And we also have other tools available to us that fall within this area that are less lethal than firearms, like the taser, like pepper spray and batons, that allow officers to project more power than their size may naturally do. And so those options are also available to them. So we provide a lot of different options, a lot of training in those different options as to where they're applicable, and they allow smaller officers to use force safely.
Thank you.
Ender?
Yeah, I was gonna weigh in that the courts have held that a person of a smaller stature. So, for example, we have an officer. She's not 5 feet tall. She would be authorized and justified in using a greater level of force than, say, our officer that's 6'7" in the exact same situation, because we may not be as physically capable to deal with that situation as somebody that's larger, right? So she has the ability, or a smaller person has the ability to potentially escalate their level of force, or the force that they are justified in using quicker than maybe someone that's of larger frame or stature. So there is that as well. But clearly, we train our officers that may be smaller not to try and be in that position if at all possible. Like Sergeant Erickson said, bring some of your backup with you. Bring some additional officers with you if you know that something has the potential to escalate. That way, it makes it less likely to happen.
Great, thank you.
And then our last couple of slides here. So, like Monty said at the beginning of this training section here, a lot of this is about decision making, and to highlight decision making that doesn't necessarily relate to use of force, but it could, depending on the circumstances, is our police vehicle operations training. So this is where we train to operate the police vehicles, whether it's just day-to-day driving defensively, or whether it's we're running lights and siren to an emergency. How do we operate the vehicle, all the way up to including getting engaged in pursuits. And so in this kind of training, this is especially as it relates to pursuits, it's a lot about decision making. And going back to that balancing act slide that we had, talking about what's the need for us to do this versus what's the risk that's created. That's a decision that has to be constantly evaluated throughout that pursuit. And when those risks are too high, then we disengage, we terminate that pursuit. And it's not only the officers involved in the pursuit that are making that calculation, it's the supervisor who's listening to the radio that's going to make that decision, or the other officers on the shift. If they think that this is too risky and we don't need to do it anymore because the risk is too high, well, they can call a termination for that pursuit and it's over. So again, it's about that decision making, that balancing act of what's the need for government intrusion, a seizure, versus what's the risk of us continuing to engage in this activity. And if that balancing act goes one way, then we'll terminate and get out of it. And then the last slide, our force on force training. So this is the culmination of the training year. It's usually the last training we do in a year. So we spend the entire year going through all these other disciplines like firearms and defensive tactics and taser and all those different training venues. And then we put the officers into scenarios with live role players. And so the officers get simulated gear to mimic all of their equipment that they're supplied with on a daily basis, that they can use safely in the training. And then there's a role player in a padded suit underneath street clothes that acts out a scripted part that forces the officer or the officers to make a decision about what is reasonable under the totality of the circumstances. And it can be anywhere from somebody who comes running up to the officers to say, real quickly, I saw something happening over there, you need to go deal with it. And the officer just, is caught off guard real quick and then, okay, thanks. All the way up to simulated a deadly force encounter where they have to use deadly force to overcome some sort of threat. And it's the whole gambit in between. And it could start out where it's a person in crisis armed with a weapon, and we're able to successfully, through using space and time to our advantage, de-escalate that situation and not have to use any force. It's all of that. And so at the end of the year, all of those other training disciplines are brought together in this one force on force training, where we're evaluating and training those officers' decision-making abilities, and it puts stress. And that's we intentionally do it that way, to put officers under a little bit of stress as they're going into it, because that's how they're going to be out in the field. If they're presented with this kind of situation, they're going to be under stress trying to deal with it. So if we can put them under stress in the scenarios and the training in a safe environment, then they're more better equipped to deal with that situation out on the road. And each time we put an officer through a scenario, every time they experience something out on the street, or every time they play a what if game where they're thinking about something that may happen, they're creating a script in their brain on how to deal with that situation, and it allows them to respond quicker and more safer, and not have to resort to higher levels of force and fall into that public expectation area of what's right and not necessarily what's necessary. And that is the last slide that we have for you. So we're happy to take any more questions that we have.
Jeff, please.
First, thank you both for taking us all through this. There's a ton of really good information, and I learned a lot. So thank you. De-escalation isn't a tactic or technique. I think like the definition of de-escalation is different in my mind, but I think I can anchor myself in that that definition. So we talked also a lot about physical use of force training. Is there also training on negotiating tactics or ways to communicate with people in order to get de-escalation?
Yeah, and so there's no specific training for it. They cover some of that in the academy, but as officers work through this career, they figure out ways to talk to people in different circumstances. And the successful officers are the ones that are able to apply those on a daily basis. So there's no magic thing that we can create that says, if you do this, it's going to bring calm to the situation. It's situational, and you have to figure that out. Some folks are born with that gift of gab, and they're able to do that just naturally. And most of us develop that over time as we go through our careers. And we have other officers, when we first come out of the academy, we go through about 4 or 5 months of field training where we're learning from experienced officers, and we're seeing how they handle those situations, and we're learning from them. And then when we go on calls with other officers, we're seeing that, and we're experiencing it, and we're learning from it. And then we start to apply it on our own as we go through the years of our job.
Sure.
And with de-escalation, it's a sliding scale. It's a goal. It's a desired outcome there. So de-escalating someone might mean we might have to still use force, but we are able to de-escalate down to the point we didn't have to shoot at them. We didn't have to. De-escalation doesn't mean there's no force involved. What de-escalation does is we're using as little amount of force as possible. So like Sergeant Erickson said, the people that can communicate well, the people that can make those connections with everybody on the street with all different walks of life, everybody's into heightened emotional states when we deal with them. So the people that can make those connections are the ones that are really successful in this career.
Cool. Thank you. And I think it's just worth throwing it out there for the group to consider. Rightfully so, there's great training on use of force, because when that has to occur, it can be very dangerous for police and for the community. So it's, rightfully so, it's there. But looking at the numbers of total contacts, in 2020, there's over 35,000 contacts with the public, right, across calls for service or self-initiated, and there's 47 use of force. So 99.8% of these contacts are straight communication, and I'm assuming there were arrests made within that, without any force. So just knowing that there's no specific training on negotiation or communicating in order to get that gives me pause when it's such a high percentage of the total contacts with the public.
Thank you, Jeff. And Chief, I see that you raised your hand.
Yeah, I'm going to basically add to what these guys have said and put some clarity to it. the communication is happening all the time. As the slide indicates, force on force, that starts with your verbal contact, given the scenario you're given. And so part of the evaluation is, what do you say to even start this, and what commands do you give? And that's all critiqued. Also, the crisis intervention training and de-escalation that we're trying to get gives 40 additional hours that do nothing but, how do you talk to somebody who has Alzheimer's, who has various disorders, and which is what the levy passed, because it takes a lot to unplug somebody for 40 hours and get them in this training. So our goal, everybody in uniform to that training, and we're slowly whittling away. We got paused by COVID because that is very much a hands-on scenario based, and you're using your mental health professionals, your clinicians. And so there is, when we talk about, as you heard Commander McDonald talk about police legitimacy, right? There's a lot of explaining. So when you take the time to explain to somebody why you do the things that you do, that's all part of de-escalation. That's why it's so important to understand that there is not a magic pill. There's not a magic, anything that may de-escalate an individual. Somebody who's mental health or substance use disorder could react differently, but we train our officers on the fact that they could react differently. Also, if you are culturally sensitive, there's training that we've given that will say, it's better use these skills, or don't inflame it in this manner. So I think, an appropriate thing is we do actually infuse most of our training with our communication in mind, first and foremost.
Thank you for that clarification, Chief. And Sean, I see your hand.
Just tagging on to Jeff's comments. I'm a numbers guy, and statistically, we have there's a large number of calls for service in this community. And we know there's issues. There's a micronutrient deficiency across the U.S. There's the health crisis.
Sean, sorry, would you mind being a little closer to your microphone? A lot of folks are having issues hearing.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I seem to have had a computer update issue, so this is my first time testing Zoom. Can you guys hear me?
It's a little better, yeah.
Anyways, sorry, I got sidetracked there. Anyways, lots of root causes for reasons for use of force, and I can't help but think, when you can't control all situations. When you have people that have, are worn out for their arrest, and they're trying to get away, I just can't imagine the pressure that is on the individuals in some of these situations. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. And Jeff?
Yeah, thank you for the clarification, Chief, on that other type of training. I think it might be valuable at least for me, to learn kind of more specifics around that training, because to me that falls in the same bucket as this use of force. Because it's, if you can de-escalate using that other training you're speaking of, then you don't have to use force. So I think it's part of it. It'd be great to see some of that.
Commander, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the next topics we're covering in the PSAB? Because I know we're talking about more training.
Yeah, we're going to get more into some of the specifics of training, and that's where some of the board members, or if you choose, are going to get the opportunity to hop in and experience some of the scenario-based training that we do. I think the other thing that I can hit, Jeff, to your point, where you asked about how many arrests are made without using force. I mean, I can actually get that figure for you, because it is a very, it's still a very low percentage of all the arrests that we make. I don't have it right in front of me. I was trying to look for it, but I couldn't find it. I know I have it, but yeah, you're right. The vast majority of arrests that we make are done without the use of force. So yeah, there. So we're going to hit the some of the more finite points of the training that Lee and Monty have talked about tonight. So when we talk about force on force, we'll get a little bit deeper into that, where we talk about maybe some of the scenarios, give some examples of some scenarios and things like that. We'll have a section on driving, because quite honestly, driving is one of the most dangerous things that we do. We have officers out there driving vehicles every single day, and very often they're turning on their lights and sirens. And all of you, if you think about when you hear and see lights and sirens, if it's a fire engine or an ambulance, it makes you nervous enough. When you see and hear a police car, it makes you, most people, even more nervous, myself included. If I'm driving my personal vehicle and all of a sudden red and blue lights from a police car come up behind me, I almost panic, like, oh, what did I do? Right? And that's a normal response for most people. So we train our officers to be aware of that. So that's one of the things we'll discuss in greater detail as to how we go into training our officers to do specific tasks throughout the day. And a lot of it goes to that field training that we do with them, so that they are all, that they're experiencing as many different types of things, types of scenarios, types of calls as possible when they're in their training phase, and they have a coach there with them to help them through it if necessary. That way, when they get out on their own, when they're a solo officer, when they have these higher stress situations come in front of them, they're equipped with the knowledge and the skill set to be able to address those appropriately without doing too little, but without doing too much as well. So we're going to get into some more of the finer points of training of what we do, to include the crisis intervention training that the chief mentioned, because that does get into the fact of how do we deal with those community members that are in crisis, right? Out of those 47, and I will tell you this, the percentage wise, because 2020, everybody always throws an asterisk next to you now, right? Because of the pandemic. So 2020, in terms of the force used by officers, in 2018, we used force 0.13% of the time. In 2019, it was 0.14% of the time. And in 2020, it was back to 0.13% of the time. So it's very consistent over at least that 3-year period. And I can tell you, it doesn't change much over like the previous 2 or 3 years as well. I could go back and it would be very consistent. So when we talk about those types of things, the frequency, it still remains very consistent. But out of the 47 from 2020, 11 of those 47 times it was force used in a case where someone was experiencing a mental health crisis of some sort. So 11 of those 47 would be considered something that was someone was in some level of crisis. So, and the percentage is pretty darn low when you compare the number of calls that we respond to for people that are in crisis as well. And I don't have the actual percentage, but I could find that out if anybody's interested. So yeah, you'll hear more and more about how we train our officers and what we do to try and make sure that we meet the community expectation as well.
Thank you, Commander. I don't see any other hands, but I realized there was a lot of information that was thrown out this evening. We will be sharing that PowerPoint deck with everybody. And if you have questions between now and our next meetings, things that you think of after you sleep tonight and this kind of seeps in a little more, please send those to Eduardo. He'll be collecting any questions, theming and categorizing them, and we'll be getting answers back out to the group. And we also sent the use of force policy, so please review that as well. And if you have any questions on that, please send those to Eduardo too. Thank you very much, Sergeants. Wonderful presentation tonight.
Thank you for having us.
And with that, John, I think we can move into our discussion on current events.
Great. Well, thank you, Sergeant Erickson and Monty. Great presentation, and I appreciate the very detailed and informative deck that you presented. Right now, we're going to move into the opportunity to discuss current event and how they impact the Tigard community. So I invite the board member to reflect on any current event and their impact on the Tigard community. This is a space for the board member to speak about current events and the impact on Tigard community. So I will open up the floor for the board.
Jimmy.
A couple of things. One is personal, so I'll deal with the personal first. On July 1st, I was at Cook Park walking my son's dog and happened upon two individuals breaking into a car. And the car happened to be mine. I had my son's dog with me, who happens to be more of a pet than a guard dog. So I want you to know that as I told my wife, I went into total, what I will call feminine histrionics. And I screamed. It was not deep. It was loud, very, very loud. Enough to cause those two gentlemen to leave my car and hightail it out of the park in their car. We got plenty of video. But what I really wanted to say that in terms of for the general public is two officers came to Cook Park. And I remember the first officer's name. His name is Officer Jose Orozco. And Officer Orozco was amazing. He carefully took all the information. I gave him all the information that I had, gave him copies of photos, whatnot. But he indicated, even though this was a car break-in, he said, Mr. Brown, I will get back to you as soon as possible with any additional information or information needs that I have. And I filed it away and I said, thank you very much. I appreciate you all coming down here. And the next day he called me back and gave me some more additional information and did some more work on this particular situation. Whether or not they are able to identify or capture these particular individuals, for me isn't really the issue. The fact that he did such a good job engaging with me, it was very clear that his training on how to deal with someone who was in an upsetting situation went very well. And I told him, I said, I'm on the PSAB. I will be speaking about this situation on Monday. And I just want you to know, I wanted to give him a shout out because he was awesome. And then, of course, the second piece relates to something that I read maybe a week or so ago, and it actually related to an event that was held out in Gresham, Oregon, relating to police resources in Gresham and the concerns that that Gresham PD had relating to cuts in their budget. And it was interesting that the article indicated that there were several police officers there and there were Tigard police officers there as well. I don't know what the policy is. I don't know if they were there on their own time. I don't know if they were there in uniform or whatnot. But I do know that the article stated that, it was interesting that Tigard police officers were there, given that Tigard Police Department had received a approval by the community for additional resources. And I kind of thought initially when I read that article that I thought, well, I can understand that police officers want to support other police officers and other police departments when they feel that they have resource needs, that they want to improve their public safety processes in their own community. But I had to reflect that it did not feel that comfortable for me, because in one respect, in Tigard, we supported the police. We gave them resources. And yes, Gresham has some issues around funding. It just felt uncomfortable to me. It just felt like there was a sense that, you know, our department is supporting you because you didn't get any money. And it just did not, it felt queasy to me. And again, you know, I know that officers probably on their own time can go pretty much and do and say and support what they want to say. They certainly have that right to do that, but it just didn't feel, you know, that good to me to have to read that in the news article.
Thank you, Jimmy. And Chief, please.
Yeah, I'm going to comment on both of them. Thanks, Jimmy. The first one, it's always nice to hear because Officer Orozco is only in his second phase. And I believe when he went to your call, he was still in his first phase. So he was with a training officer. And you know, it speaks to the people that we onboard. He is a levy officer, and the people we're trying to bring into our culture. So I always love to hear the positive feedback, and I'll be happy to share it with him because he's a fine young man and he's learning a lot. And just saw him today in shift briefing, and he was smiling the entire time. He is happy to be there and very appreciative. Raised, but as always, we are always faced with it. It evoked an emotion by you and maybe to others, but that was a scene for all union leaders with the talk about policing in Oregon. Small was resources, but the other is police reform, morale, the increase in violent crimes, all of that they asked to bring it. Nick went because of the optics. We talked about whether or not that would be on duty, that because he was in his role as union president, he would go because he wanted to listen and have a voice at the table that was said. So that was something that I went to if they could, and it was hosted in the Gresham area. Again, I'll let Nick speak, but the resources from Tigard is very much appreciative. While we have many injured and many in military deployment, we know we get to add and on board. But there's so much, as you know, as you're learning with policing going on, that a congressman just ask, hey, how are you guys? And Nick, I'll let you add anything more that you want to on that.
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is, it was last Thursday. I was contacted by the union presidents from OSP, the Oregon State Police, and asked to participate with a bunch of union leaders. So as the chief said, I actually took the day off and went on my own time, and it was with two congressmen from Washington, D.C. And I met with them along with, there's about 15, 20 union leaders, and talking about, it's funny that they talk about, this story. There were no reporters in there, so they don't know what we actually talked about. Police, the numbers and stuff like that we were in there for close to 2 hours, and that was a small portion of actually what was talked about. But there was a lot of stuff regarding police reform and the congressman asking what Washington, D.C. can do to help. A couple of the people that were there, that was their first time in Portland. So they had a lot of talk about the Portland area, because prior to coming to meeting with us, they did get a tour of Portland. So they had questions about Oregon and Portland in general, but police numbers and stuff was a small portion of what we actually talked about.
Thank you,
So-
Officer.
so-
Jimmy, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah. Let me lower my hand for a second. And thanks, Nick, for giving a little bit more information on it. Here's the optics that I think were well worth talking about. We had a representative from the state of Washington and a representative from outside of the state of Oregon, outside of the city of Portland. For just for identification purposes, they were both Republicans. I'm not saying it's necessarily a blue versus red or Republican versus Democratic situation, but the optics of a representative from the state of Washington representing Clark County, Vancouver, who has a history, Vancouver, of allowing its Proud Boy groups to come into Portland, into our areas, and demonstrate and wreak havoc in communities, doesn't sit well for me when they're talking about police funding issues. If they could not deal with the fact that they have racist white guys running around out in their community, but they want to come over and talk about what's happening in Portland, just didn't, and then they're in Gresham, just didn't sit well. And then when I see that a member of our department was, no names, but just, representatives from Tigard were there, blah, 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 then it just didn't fit well in the optics, in the general optics of having a photo op or a meeting opportunity to talk about how bad things are in our area relating to police services, and bringing that forward with individuals who don't represent the state of Oregon or local politics here. So it's, I understand going out and supporting what other union leaders are saying or doing in their particular communities. But I also get concerned about our officers getting played for somebody else's agenda. And that's part of what happens in that situation from me looking at and reading this particular information. Whether or not there was the local press was available, it made it into the local press. So somebody made some statements to somebody as a journalist, or perhaps there was a journalist that was there, I don't know. But it did make it into the local press. And again, it just made me feel uneasy because I said to myself as I'm reading this, well, I know Tigard isn't in that particular boat because our voters passed our levy for public safety services. And as Chief said, I got to meet one of the officers that came through as a result of that particular levy. So again, Nick, I thank you for letting me know that you were there on an invite and you were there on your own time. I just get concerned about folks getting played for somebody else's national agenda. And especially when, it's like the pot calling the tea kettle black. When you got stuff going on in your own community, but you're going to cross the river and come over here and talk about, it's not safe in your city. Well, you got folks coming over here acting like fools too. So let's talk about those kinds of things. So, okay.
And I think another thing that wasn't mentioned probably in that article is that he didn't just come to Oregon. He's been going to several states and having the exact same conversation with members of law enforcement so that he can go back, because he's one of the senior members on one of the committees. And so he wanted input so that he can go back to the committee in DC and voice what he's learned from all these different union leaders. So Portland is only one of the stops that they've made to talk to different law enforcement. So we were one of many stops that he's making.
Thank you, Officer, for the clarification. Thank you, Jimmy, for bringing that up. And John, I think you were our last hand, and then we'll be moving into next steps.
Sure. Reflecting on the presentation today, and I just want to thank the Tigard PD for their excellent work in working with the community, especially around people who have mental health challenges. Again, I work for a New Narrative, which is a behavioral health company, and I experienced a lot of folks who may have some challenges in their interaction with law enforcement in Tigard. And I have to say, in terms of the training that Commander McDonald talked about, just the de-escalation, crisis intervention training, it all worked. And when we talk about in terms of use of force, I hardly see any use of force with folks who are having some challenges, or especially mental health challenges, and going through a crisis. And so I want to just applaud the Tigard PD for their excellent work in working with this population. So with that, if there's no more comment, I want to just to the agenda. And so the next step is really in terms of wrapping up and talking about next step. So with that, I'm going to ask Kim if you could give us in terms of what the next steps are for us.
Yeah, so looking ahead to the next couple meetings, hopefully, schedules pending, we'll have Representative Graber as well as a legislative update from the chief at our next meeting. If not, then we'll continue talking about training. Over the next few weeks, please review the PowerPoint, think about the conversations that we had this evening, look over the use of force policy, and please send any questions, comments, concerns that you have to Eduardo, and he'll start working through and categorizing and theming and getting answers back to the group. With that, those are our next steps.
Well, thank you, Kim. Again, I want to thank the board for your thoughtful engagement today. Your question, your thoughts, your comments, they continue to impress me. So I appreciate everyone work on this. This is important jobs that we're doing here, part of this Public Safety Advisory Board. So I want to thank you all for your participation today. With that, I want to call for a motion to adjourn. Who would like to motion?
So moved.
Thank you, Valerie. In 1 second.
Second.
Thank you, Jamie. Any more discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye.
All right.
All right. No, thank you very much. I hear none, so meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Night, guys.